Hi, my name is Gene Preuss. I'm an associate professor of history at the University of Houston downtown. Today, I want to talk to you about Mexican Americans and the question of education. In this presentation, I'm going to discuss three topics. First, I'm going to cover briefly who are Mexican Americans? What does the term mean? Then I want to look at the importance of education. And finally, how education relates to civil rights in Mexican American history, especially in Texas, and how this ties into history, culture, and identity. So, who are Mexican Americans? There are a lot of names that are commonly associated today with Mexican Americans or Hispanics, and some of these are historical names. In older literature, you might see the term Spanish speaking people. You might see the term Mexicans used to describe a broad variety of people. Latin Americans is a more recent term. Spanish surnames was a more official bureaucratic term. And then there are terms like Chicano, Hispanic, and then there are terms like Latina and Latinx. And what do these terms mean? Well, some people use these to describe a broad variety of people. Most people who are of Hispanic, Mexican American background identify as Latino or Hispanic, and most prefer today the term Hispanic. In Texas, that is the predominant term. However, there are other people who use different terms. Not all Hispanics come from Mexico or have Mexican ancestry. There are a wide variety of other Hispanic groups in Texas today. But historically, if we look at the population, up until about the 1980s, the majority of people had Mexican backgrounds. And there's a difference between race and ethnicity as well. We tend to group Hispanics as one group, but within that group, there are Afro Hispanics, there are Asian Hispanics, and other different types of groups as people have mingled together. And this is something that we often overlook when we're talking about ethnicity and race. And this information was compiled as early as 2012 or as late as 2012. If we look at the early history of Hispanics and Mexican Americans in Texas and then this region, we have to realize that when we're talking about Mexican Americans, we are talking about indigenous people or the descendants of indigenous people. If we look at the contact between Europeans and native people, that can be traced back to 1528. The first recorded incidents we have is that of Cabeza de Vaca, who was on an exploration cruise with the governor of Florida at the time, and they were shipwrecked. They made their way to Texas, where they were shipwrecked again, and the survivors, including Cabeza de Vaca, lived for a few years among Native Americans, and it were the first Europeans that we know of to set foot on the mainland. These explorers and later missionaries who came to what is today Texas also have an interesting story in the 1600s of the Lady in Blue. This image that you see on the screen is of a monument that's now currently in San Angelo, Texas, that was recently put up to capture this story. Supposedly, Native American people came to missionaries saying that they had discussed a lady in blue who had talked to them about religion and that they should seek out the missionaries to learn more about Christianity. Whether or not this is true or whether or not you believe in it, it does form an interesting story about early contact and the reception of some Native Americans to the Spanish church, the Catholic Church, and to religion. And it did help to instill a sense among the Spanish missionaries that missions needed to be installed. What those missions did, along with mixing of soldiers and townsfolk with Native Americans, not only helped to convert Native Americans, but also helped to assimilate them into Spanish culture. Today in Austin, we have the Tejano Monument at the Texas State Capitol grounds. And in the monument, it pays tribute to a long history and a long heritage of Mexican-American history in Texas, all the way back from the explorers, the conquistadors, through ranchers and settlers that helped form the early residents of the state. In 1820, and this is when a lot of people kind of see the beginning of Texas history, it's really the beginning of Moses and Stephen F. Austin's settlement in Texas, when it brought more Americans into this part of what was Mexico. In the 1820s, the Austin colony was established. In this map here, you can see several of the other impresario contracts that were established, the DeWitt colony. But we're going to look a little bit further south at the Martin de Leon colony. And Martin de Leon was a Mexican settler who was granted an impresario contract, and he brought up family members and others to settle in the area of South Texas. There were other scattered settlements throughout early Texas, early Anglo Texas, that included Mexican American people or Mexican people at the time. These were Nacogdoches, which had already been an established settlement, San Antonio, San Felipe de Austin, and Harrisburg, or today Houston. We also know that by the time of the Texas Revolution, Mexicans did participate on both sides. Probably the most famous are Erasmo and Juan Seguin, father and son, who were active in the Texas Revolution, supported the American side of the Texas Revolution. You also had Mexicans who did sign the Texas Declaration of Independence, including Jose Antonio Navarro, Jose Francisco Ruiz, and Lorenzo de Zavala. So there is a long history of Mexican participation in Texas history. The turning point in Mexican-U.S. relations came in 1846 to 1848 with the U.S.-Mexican War. This is often an overlooked war in American history and in Texas history, as a matter of fact. The important thing about this war was that the United States garnered, as a result of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, a large swath of what is today now the American Southwest. Texas, Colorado, New Mexico, Utah, California, all came in to the U.S. as a territory. Also important in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo for Mexican-American history was that the treaty stipulated that Mexican residents who remained in this territory, in what became the territory the Mexicans ceded to the Union, were allowed full citizenship in the United States to keep their territory, to keep their land, and to maintain all the rights of whichever citizenship they chose to follow. And in the case of those who remained in the North, American citizenship. Although there were relatively few Mexicans who remained in the American Southwest. Now, this was largely due to problems that they faced following the Texas Revolution, discrimination, prejudice, attempts to take land that continued on through the U.S.-Mexican War and into the immediate period after the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, did state that Mexican citizens who remained and became American citizens would be granted full citizenship rights, would keep their land. But instead, what happened in some cases is the land was taken from them, either by hook or by crook, or by legal or extra legal means. Many just left because they felt discrimination. And in these cases, this depopulated Mexicans living in Texas, or Mexican Americans living in the American Southwest. By 1910, events south of the border precipitated a change in the population status. The Mexican Revolution, which at its most active happened between 1910 to 1930, the violence the disruption, the turmoil surrounding the Mexican Revolution led many Mexicans to flee Mexico across the Rio Grande and the American border into places like California and Texas. This increased the Mexican-born population in Texas tremendously. It also led to concern among groups that they needed to form some sort of identity, some sort of cultural bond. And this resulted in what are known as mutual aid societies or mutualistas. And these groups came together to try to provide some sort of safety net for their members. This included helping them find jobs, helping funerals, helping at celebrations in order to build that network that they felt that they had lost when they left Mexico. By 1930, the population in Texas was about 15,000, and this increased cultural awareness led to the formation of other organizations besides the mutualistas. During the Great Depression, there was a period of Americanization. There were organizations that came together and formed, like the League of United Latin American Citizens, LULAC. This was an organization founded in Corpus Christi in 1929, but it had roots in other mutualista and benefit societies that had formed in Texas prior to that. Another issue that especially concerned Mexican Americans living in Texas was an attempt to root out Mexican citizens living in the United States, and there was a repatriation movement. The idea behind this was that it was easier to live in poverty in an impoverished nation. And so the United States encouraged Mexicans, sometimes people forcefully encouraged Mexican and Mexican Americans to leave the United States and to go across the border into Mexico. This proved especially harmful to many young people who had been born in the United States and knew no other country, and then were suddenly forced to move with their parents to Mexico. It uprooted and displaced hundreds of thousands of people. In World War II, the situation turned a bit because on the home front, there was a need for workers. As American men and women joined the military or military support organizations and industries, there was a need in the fields for laborers. The United States turned to Mexico and established the Bracero Program. This was a 20-year program that allowed itinerant and temporary Mexican farm laborers and manual laborers to come into the United States, work during harvest season, especially across the United States, on the agreement that they would return at specific times. Now, of course, that didn't always happen, but we do see this leading to regular annual migrations of farm laborers and their families, who often worked beside them in the farms and in the fields, into the United States. Many settled and continued to live here. There was also the development post-World War II of organizations like American GI Forum. Now, this kind of sprouted from LULAC and other organizations, but it was aimed to help Mexican Americans who had served in the military to ensure that they received the GI Bill of Rights benefits that they were entitled to. Let's look at the importance of education in the Mexican American community in Texas. And this really gets underway in the 1960s. And so I'm going to skip ahead a little bit chronologically at this point and look at the growing political activity in the Mexican American community by the 1960s. One of the milestone events that occurred was that John Kennedy, President of the United States, came to Houston, Texas, along with Vice President Lyndon Johnson, Kennedy's wife, Jacqueline Kennedy, and Lady Bird Johnson, And they came to Houston to the Rice Hotel to attend the LULAC State Meeting, an event that was happening on November 21st, 1963. Mrs. Kennedy spoke Spanish to the crowd, and it was really seen as a way of cementing Kennedy's image and Johnson's later to the cause of Mexican American civil rights. Now, of course, this happened the night before he traveled to Dallas and was assassinated. And so the tragic events of the next day further cemented in the Mexican American mind the importance of this meeting, that Mexican Americans were seen by the federal government and by politicians as being an important and attention-worthy group. You also had attention being paid in California to the strikes that were going on, led by Cesar Chavez at the Delano Fields in California in the 1960s. In Texas, you also had several strikes among farm laborers as well. 1963, 1969 in Crystal City, you had school children and city people who were concerned about representation on the school board, on the PTA, and in the Crystal City City Council. And there were walkouts and strikes in the schools that reveals the frustration that many in the Mexican American community, which was almost a 90% of the population, and yet saw very little representation on the school boards and in school activities. One of the events that precipitated the strike was the inability of a Mexican American cheerleader to be elected to serve on the cheerleading team, even though the student body was predominantly Mexican American. In 1966, a farm workers' march left Starr County in the Rio Grande Valley and moved up to Austin, gathering support, gathering members and marchers who wanted to take their grievances to the governor of Texas at the time. The governor, John Connally, refused to meet with them, which is ironic because Connally was a protege of Lyndon Johnson, who very readily identified with causes in the Mexican American community. You see the development in Texas and then across the nation of a political party for Mexican Americans called La Raza Unida, the People United. And what they were concerned about was representation. They didn't feel that the Democrats or the Republicans, for that matter, were really supporting them. At that time in Texas politics, the Democratic Party was the predominant party. Eventually, the Democrats do assimilate people who support La Raza Unida and other groups by 1978, but there are still concerns that the Mexican American voice isn't being heard. You also have in Houston an event that happened in 1977 that seemed to solidify and to further draw attention to discrimination and brutality that people of Mexican American descent faced from police. Now, this went hand in hand with African Americans, Black civil rights causes and concerns at the same time. On May 6th, 1977, a Vietnam veteran, Mexican American Jose Campos Torres, was arrested by police, beat up, and thrown in Buffalo Bayou in Houston downtown to drown. His body was found the next week, which was on Mother's Day, and his mother was notified of this. This led to a lot of concern and outrage. And the next year, when the police only received a very light sentence, probation, and a $1 fine for the charges, a riot happened in Moody Park that many came to associate as a protest against the Jose Campos Torres decision. On the other side, there was some growing attention of the importance politically of the Hispanic American community. And in 1968, President Lyndon Johnson declared Hispanic Heritage Week for people of Hispanic descent. And in this speech, he said the people of Hispanic descent are heirs of the missionaries, captains, soldiers, and farmers who were motivated by a young spirit of adventure and desire to settle freely in a free land. This heritage is ours. These were Johnson's words, and you can kind of see the same imagery in the Austin Monument that's erected today. Part of this attention was fueled, in fact, by the growth of the Hispanic community in the United States and in Texas. Mexican Americans by this time are only part of the US Latino population, still 60%, but there is an increase in population between 1970 and 1980, and then another increase between the 1980s and 1990s. By 1990, Mexican Americans form 9% of the total US population, and most of those are in the three states, New Mexico, California, and Texas. In some areas, you do see Mexican Americans and other Hispanics becoming the majority in some communities. Part of this growth is led by increased birth rate among the Hispanic citizenry, but some of it is also due to increased immigration coming from Mexico and other Hispanic countries. You see that most of the population at this time is young and continues to be young, and that most of them, different from the past when most of them were considered to live in the rural areas or in agricultural areas, by the 1980s, 1990s, many of them are living in urban areas. Many, if not the majority of them, are living in urban areas, especially in places like Los Angeles and San Francisco and California. In Texas, the big areas are San Antonio, Corpus Christi, El Paso, and Laredo. By this same time period, half of the school population in Houston is Hispanic. You also see, along with the growth in population, of an increasing political power for Mexican American and other Hispanic voters. Part of this is led by groups like La Raza Unida, which got actively involved and encouraged young people, the young Hispanic Chicano community, to get involved in politics and often case run for office. You also had groups like Southwest Voter Education Project, led by Willie Velasquez from San Antonio, who encouraged older Mexican Americans and younger Mexican Americans to register to vote and fought for voter rights. You also then have groups of elected officials, NALEO, National Association of Latino elected officials, which began in 1979, which promoted from three different areas now, right? Elected Hispanics, voting Hispanics, and young Hispanics. In Texas, you have the Texas House of Representatives Mexican American Legislative Caucus. Then you also have the development a few years later of the Texas Senate Hispanic Caucus. Likewise, in Washington, D.C., among representatives from Hispanic-speaking backgrounds, you see the U.S. Congressional Hispanic Caucus as well. The increased growth and the increased political power is representative of changes in immigration laws as well. In 1965, the Hart-Celler Act, sometimes called the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965, removed the long-standing national origin quotas that had been in place in United States law since the late 1920s. Many of these laws were put in place because of many immigrants who were coming over from Southern Europe were leading to these changes in laws in the 1920s. By 1965, President Lyndon Johnson wanted to eliminate some of these. Then in 1978, President Carter formed the Select Committee on Immigration and Refugee Policy, SCRIP. This not only sought to look at immigration, but interestingly enough, did not recommend increased immigration. And what is said, and this is a quote, is the first order priority is bringing undocumented and illegal immigration under control, and at the same time setting up a rational system for legal immigration. In the 1980s, we also see an increase in Cuban refugees fleeing Castro's regime. Then you have 61% increase in Latin American immigration between the 1970s and 1980s, a 61% increase. So it's this tremendous continued increase in the latter part of the 20th century that gives rise to a swelling Hispanic and Mexican American population within the United States. Now let's shift our focus to education and civil rights in the Mexican American community. It wasn't unusual to see in the 1940s, around the time of World War II, images of lingering discrimination and Jim Crow racism in the American South. And in places like Texas, this was a restaurant association sign that announced to potential customers that not only were dogs not allowed in the restaurant, but neither were Blacks or Mexican Americans. And this was at a time right at the beginning of the Bracero movement, which may have prompted signs like this to go up in some segregated parts of the state and segregated businesses across the nation. But segregation didn't begin in World War II. We can trace segregation in education back much further. The first official record we have in Texas of separate schools can be dated back to this excerpt from the school board minutes of the Seguin Independent School District in 1902. And this, you can see that the secretary of the school board wrote in minutes that Mexican children be allowed a separate school and the proration of the public school free funds be allocated to them, and that the motion carried. So this is the first documented evidence we have of this in Texas, but the practice happened commonly. However, you may recall that going back to the 1848, some 60 years earlier, the United States and the Republic of Mexico had agreed that Mexican citizens remaining in the US would get full citizenship rights. This was different from the established as late as 1898 Supreme Court case in Plessy versus Ferguson, that the separate but equal was okay for Blacks. Mexican Americans did not face the same legal discrimination that Black Americans faced, but it still occurred. Spotty and in random places, but it still occurred. And this is evidence of that. And so you see schools in Central Texas, as the Mexican American population increased, increasingly turn in many cases to separate schools for Hispanic children. Now, this was seen as an acceptable way of dealing with a language issue, that many of the Mexican American students did not speak English, was the reason given. However, we also have to realize, and evidence is borne out, that in many cases, some of these Hispanic children were actually of mixed ancestry, that coming from parents who were, maybe the father was German or some other Czech or some other type of settler in Texas, and the mother was Hispanic, or vice versa. And so that rationale that there was a language barrier may not have always been the case. One of the most famous incidents of this happened in 1928. And here you have in the center of this picture of a school class, the teacher who was a young Lyndon Baines Johnson, who would go on to become president of the United States. Lyndon Johnson started off his professional career while in college to be a teacher. He served as the principal of a Mexican school in Cotulla, Texas. He was assigned to be there for a year, And there he sat with his students and he taught speech and other subjects to the students. This experience at Cotulla stayed in LBJ's mind for the rest of his life. He often referred to it, even as president, in speeches when he was signing civil rights bills and legislation. And this was in the town of Bastrop, Texas, that several families and students were organized by San Antonio attorney Gus Garcia, Houston attorney John J. Herrera, who brought these cases together to challenge the practice of segregation of Mexican American students in school. The case was styled as Delgado versus Bastrop. One Mexican American professor at the University of Texas, George Sanchez, went out and took photographs to help support the case. And in some cases, the evidence shows that school districts had built new schools for either Black students or Mexican American students. This was sometimes used to show that they were getting good, separate but equal schools. But in other cases, they were fraudfully old and decrepit buildings, long out of repair, with not much plumbing, indoor plumbing. Students had to use outhouses. In some cases, students had to use outside water faucets to drink water from. So they weren't really up to standard in other cases. This is a photograph of the Mina School in Bastrop that formed the basis for the title case in the decision of Delgado versus Bastrop in 1946. What we see is a unique combination of personalities who were interested in civil rights growing out of this case. You had people at the top left who represented American GI Forum. You had legislatures like Bob Eckhart, Lyndon Johnson. You had attorneys like Gus Garcia, Mexican-American attorney, who often helped LULAC cases out of San Antonio, along with attorneys A.L. Warren from Los Angeles, who worked for the American Civil Liberties Union. Interestingly enough, Gus Garcia went to school with Robert Eckhart, who was a very close friend of Lyndon Johnson. And you may recall that Lyndon Johnson had actually worked for Eckhart's relative, Robert Kleberg, as an intern in Congress. So there was an interesting hidden connection between several of these people who came together to help form a unified front to help fight segregation and discrimination in educational communities for Mexican Americans within Texas and elsewhere. In the Delgado case, Minerva Delgado, who was a 6-year-old student, had been denied the opportunity to go to the white school in Bastrop by Superintendent P.J. Dobson. And here is a photograph of both Minerva and her brother and Superintendent Dodson. Dodson's quoted the regulation in place at Bastrop saying that she would not be allowed because there was a fear that she did not speak English. But in fact, she did. Both her and her brother did speak both English and Spanish. They were bilingual. But Dobson didn't know this. Later, Dobson and his wife would become very important and well-beloved teachers in Minerva Delgado and other students' minds, even though he did uphold, because he was required to do so, the separate schools edict. Minerva Delgado went on to win that case and later on enrolled at a school and college. She became a teacher in her own right in 1973. It was a photograph and a newspaper story on her in San Antonio. And then she later moved to the Houston area and retired as a teacher here. A couple of years ago, she was at a historical marker ceremony in Bastrop that paid homage to the important case Delgado versus Bastrop. She was one of the recipients of the award. Another person who was involved in that, and one of Minerva Delgado's classmates, who often spoke about the segregation he faced in school, is former Senator Gonzalo Barrientos of Austin, who grew up in Bastrop as well, and later on moved to become a legislature in Texas. I mentioned immigration increases in the 1960s earlier, and I want to return to that because these go hand in hand with education. You do see changes in attitudes about immigration. In 1977, the National Chicano Latino Conference on Immigration and Public Policy not only criticized the Carter administration's plans for undocumented workers, but also suggested fines for employers and amnesty for undocumented citizens. By the time of Ronald Reagan's appointment, Republican views on immigrations showed a significant difference and a shift. While conservatives did support a law and order approach, they tended to be a bit more accepting of immigration. Now, perhaps this was because they saw this as a way of reducing labor costs. Maybe it was because they saw increased laws against it as opposed as too much government interference. In any case, Republicans during the Reagan administration, especially Ronald Reagan, talked about this several times, that they were supportive of allowing immigrants to come in, especially for seasonal work. In 1980, there was a Refugee Act that changed the definition of the term refugee to allow for more people who were in fear of their lives from terrorism or official government punishment in their homelands. Although it did set a limit, you see an increase in gangs in the Los Angeles area that was attributed to problems in El Salvador and Guatemala with immigrants from those nations, young people coming in and joining gangs, and an increase in drug violence. I'll go back to talk about police brutality here because this mixes in with the concerns. On the one hand, we're concerned about immigration. Some people are in favor of loosening up the restrictions. Other people call for increased restrictions because of increasing gang violence. But there's also some concern about how police are dealing with the increased number of Hispanics in their areas. And many of them, as I mentioned earlier, were coming into urban areas, into cities. So you do see an anti-war moratorium against the Vietnam War. This was a protest against the war where Mexican Americans were heavily involved. One newspaper reporter, Ruben Salazar, was among those killed by police fire in that incident. In Texas, there were several incidents that drew attention not only across the state, but even nationally. In 1973, a young boy was being interrogated by police for robbery of a vending machine and was shot by a police officer playing Russian roulette, trying to interrogate this young man through intimidation, and accidentally shot him in the head. In Castroville, in southwest of San Antonio, a worker was killed by the local law enforcement officer. Richard Morales was killed, and they attempted to dump his body in the Carolinas. This drew national attention to, again, unwarranted police brutality. I mentioned the Jose Campos Torres and the Moody Park riots of 1978. And then you had beatings of people by police and deaths in jails of people like Larry Ortega Lozano in 1978. So it was this increased police violence, or at least increased attention to police violence, that also was of some concern. The Department of Justice and the Carter administration looked into it, but was criticized for not taking any steps to actually alleviate these problems. Carter did create an Office of Hispanic Affairs in 1979 and said that there needed to be more political representation and more responsiveness to the needs of Hispanic Americans. There's also the United States Commission on Civil Rights, which identified police brutality among minorities, including Mexican Americans, in cities that had large Hispanic populations like Houston, Miami, and places that we normally wouldn't think, but Philadelphia and New York, which had a large Puerto Rican population, also another Hispanic community that we see an increase of in the 20th century. As far as education was concerned, going hand in hand with the debate over immigration and the concerns of police brutality and representation, we do see some changes in education law as well. A case in 1970, some 16 years after the Brown versus Board of Education, finally extends Brown to include Mexican Americans. In the 1930s, the Del Rio decision, Del Rio versus Salvatierra, allowed that Mexicans could be segregated. Mexican and Mexican American students could be segregated. But in Cisneros, this said that separate but equal was not allowed and applied the 1954 Brown decision to include Mexican Americans as well. In the 1970s, you also had walkouts in Houston ISD. These were called huelga or strike schools, which were protesting discrimination and segregation. Another thing that Houston was trying to do and other communities tried to do is that by lumping Mexican American students and Mexican students as white, that they could integrate and achieve some balance in integration without affecting the Anglo students. What they did was they said in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo of 1848, Mexican and Mexican Americans, Hispanic students were considered white. So if we mix them with the Black students, therefore we have a balance, we've achieved integration. The white students, the Anglo students, didn't have to integrate. And this was seen as a way of skirting the law, and this prompted some of the walkouts and other problems that Houston and other school districts that were seeking to find a quick fix for integration were resorting to. In 1973, Texas passes the Bilingual Education and Training Act, allowing schools with 20 or more students who had limited English proficiency and said that they must provide bilingual instruction. In 1973, the Rodriguez case said that unequal funding does not violate the 14th Amendment. And this was a severe blow. In the Rodriguez case, Rodriguez versus Texas, LULAC and other Mexican American groups argued that they should provide equal funding to minority schools, Black schools, Hispanic schools that they did to the Anglo schools, because some were getting unequal funding even within the same districts. What the court case said was that the Supreme Court said was that because Texas allowed for a minimum foundation for education that was established in 1950, that everybody got a baseline of education, so there was no unequal funding, although some schools did get more than others. And a lot of that was because of the way Texas gets its school funding, which is through an ad valorem or property tax, property value tax. Schools in poorer neighborhoods are not going to get as much funding as schools in wealthier neighborhoods. Although the Rodriguez case did issue a setback, a decade later, a new case from the same area of San Antonio comes up, and this is the Edgewood versus Kirby district decision of 1989. This had tremendous repercussions for public schools in Texas. What the Supreme Court said was that school funding on property tax alone was unequal and thus did violate the Texas state constitution. In response, the Texas Supreme Court came up with a new plan called Robin Hood. Robin Hood just like the mythical, legendary character of British lore, robbed from the rich and gave to the poor. And so the idea behind the Robin Hood plan was that the state would allocate money from wealthier districts, which, because of their higher property values, could generate more tax dollars, and then distribute it according to a formula to poorer districts with land poor tax bases who couldn't raise as much money, so that they would be some equity among the school districts. And of course, this set in motion tremendous countersuits and problems and challenges within the Texas Educational Administration running the Robin Hood plan, a lot of complaints. Ironically, fast forward to 2020, and you see challenges from Dallas and Houston, school districts in urban areas that had traditionally been underfunded, who are now property wealthy as the decades have ensued, who are now challenging Robin Hood from the other side. As once poor districts, they received money. Now that they were wealthier, they didn't see the need for Robin Hood. So this is still yet to play out. In 1974, you have the Equal Educational Opportunities Act, which required school districts to help students overcome language barriers. And in 1974, this was reestablished in the Supreme Court decision of Lau versus Nichols. The continued concern over immigration and the correlation between immigration and language barriers continued in the latter part of the 20th century. At the end of the 20th century, you do see increased Cuban migration, Spanish-speaking Cubans coming into the United States in the 1980s. You do see the Federation for Immigration Reform in 1983, which wanted to reduce immigration. So you had people coming in from either side. There were more immigrants coming in, and there were people who were against the immigrants coming in. There was a Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986, signed by Ronald Reagan, which protected people from deportation, provided permanent resident status to people here since the 1980s. It increased the immigration in the 1980s as a result. People from other Hispanic countries besides Mexico, like El Salvador, Guatemala, Cuba. Again, there are still going to be concerns with illegal immigration. Some of these are going to come from the Hispanic community itself. Going back to LULAC in the 1950s and 60s, the increased immigration was of concern to people in LULAC and other older traditional organizations who saw themselves as Americans and were concerned that the growing immigration, that there would be splash from attention to immigrants and concerns over criminality and drug problems that the immigrants may have, that may splash over to Hispanics that had been living in the United States for many years, that discrimination would affect them as well. And so they were concerned with the illegal immigration. Others were concerned about providing more protection to immigrants. In 1990, you have another Immigration Reform Act, which did allow more legal immigration and allowed visas, the H-1Bs, for skilled employees to come in. In all of these cases, the increased immigration status is going to be more Spanish-speaking people in the United States and in places like Texas and in Florida. Now, this is going to cause concern for school districts because of laws that they're required to provide some sort of English assistance for these. Should we print our school materials in both English and Spanish? And you do see people who are speaking out against this. And here you've got a political cartoon from Florida concerned about the people who don't like English being challenged by other languages. And that laws or bills that legislation is introduced in the Texas House in the 1980s to make English the official language, or in Arizona in 1988. Many of these failed to get passed. There is some concern that they are violating free speech, that people have the right to speak their mind in whatever language they want. You also have a Supreme Court case related directly to education, this Pyler versus Doe of 1981. And this was a 1975 case that this grew out of, that said that Texas schools had to provide help for undocumented children. The excuse was that they were undocumented, so they didn't pay taxes, so that wasn't going to the school district. So the schools didn't have to provide funds to help undocumented Spanish-speaking children. The Supreme Court disagreed with that and said that all children living in the state were required to be treated fairly and to get education, that the Texas Constitution had that in it, and that if you were going to say that these students couldn't because they had not paid taxes like others, well, other people who came in who did speak English didn't always pay as much taxes. What about a new resident who moves in from California or New York or Nebraska who hasn't been paying? Are they not going to get funds? The Supreme Court said this law did not pass muster, and so it said that they had to provide funds for undocumented children. I'm going to go back and talk about 1984. Another issue that has affected Mexican American students was a nation at risk. In 1984, Ronald Reagan, who had come in to the presidency based upon the premise, in part, that he was going to get rid of the Department of Education that President Carter had created a few years earlier as a separate cabinet level office. But Reagan's first Secretary of Education puts together a commission to talk about education, and they released this report called A Nation at Risk, which instead suggested that if a nation did to their people, did to the United States, what we were doing to our own people through lack of educational funds, we would consider that an act of war. How this plays out in the States, and especially Texas, is increased importance of education. House Bill 82 in the Texas House, so-called no pass, no play law, said that failing students could not participate in UIL competition. Now, this gave rise to tremendous angst in Texas over the restrictions placed upon student athletes. In fact, one of the popular culture remnants of that is Friday Night Lights, which came out in the 1980s, which said there was too much attention paid to college football and looked at the attention to athletics over academics. When the book came out, it was reviled, and yet today it is a popular piece of Texana culture. In a nod to the importance of education and the Hispanic vote, Ronald Reagan appointed the first cabinet-level Mexican-American Texas native, Laurel Cavazos, to the U.S. Secretary of Education position in 1988. He served there for 2 years, and Cavazos, who is shown on the right here, did increased attention to issues faced by Native American communities, Black communities, and Mexican American communities. However, the Reagan administration was limiting their education budget at the federal level. And in fact, as a result of this, in response to the Reagan administration's attempts to cut funds for federal education initiatives, the three Texas representatives in the Texas Capitol in Austin walked out of a speech that Laura Cavazos, Secretary Cavazos, was given in the 1990s. The increased immigration and increasing presence of the Mexican American community in the United States led Time magazines and others to realize that what would be called the browning of America was occurring. The increased immigration, the increasing birth rate, the mixing of Anglo and Hispanic parents was leading to a different type of American than most people envisioned. And this was of growing concern of how to deal with their particular and unique issues, not only in education, but in terms of social services, in terms of employment in America in the future by 1980. Ronald Reagan did extend Hispanic Heritage Week to Hispanic Heritage Month, which is September the 15th through October the 14th of every year. And that has continued to be promoted throughout the nation. September the 15th is important because September the 14th, 15th, 16th, in that week, many Latin American nations, south of the border nations, celebrate their independence from Spain or from Brazil during that period. And so this is the reason why that date was chosen. By the late 1990s, it became very evident to most observers that Anglo-Americans would not be the majority by the 21st century. And in fact, we've seen this come true. For many Mexican Americans, the increased attention has led to increased cultural icons that are represented not only in the Hispanic and Mexican American communities, but also identifiable by other communities as well. And maybe perhaps the most culturally significant was the inclusion of a Barbie doll in 1979 that was Hispanic, but you also had plays, most famous of which was Zoot Suit, talking about the World War II Zoot Suit riots in California that hit the Great White Way, the Broadway stage in 1979. You also had actors and comedians, performers like Cheech Marin, as many people know him from the Cheech and Chong comedy movies, but also who still continues to act, perform. Other actors like Edward James Olmos, cultural icons like Selena, who was one of the first Tejano performers to actually cross over into the English-speaking world of music as well. She's been called the Queen of Tejano music. Unfortunately, her life was cut short and her career was cut short with her murder in 1995 when she was still very young. You had movies like La Bamba celebrating Richie Valens, who most people didn't know was Hispanic, who died along with Buddy Holly and the Big Bopper in a plane crash in 1959. And also, maybe not always what a lot of people like to identify with, was that Coors beer began the decade of the Hispanics in order to attract more attention. But it shows that marketing, that Wall Street was attentive to the increased presence of Hispanics, the increased attention of Spanish-speaking people, and trying to meet their needs in a variety of different ways in order to profit from them. For education and Hispanics, the question has been about access, equality, and even some might argue higher performance, excellence, access, equity, and excellence. So in 1968, you do have some Supreme Court cases that began to come down. I talked before about the Rodriguez decision, and this later on follow-up Edgewood versus Kirby. In 1983, I mentioned a Nation at Risk commission, the Preuss Commission here in Texas, that did no pass, no play. And that affected, there were a lot of Hispanics and other minorities who were playing sports who were affected by this. And it tried to emphasize education over the athletics. In 1989, the National Governors Summit on Education met. Laura Cavazos was one of the presiders at that, and also a young Bill Clinton. And in 1990, this is a photo here in the background of President at the time, George H.W. Bush, a Texan, who was signing the White House Initiative on Educational Excellence for Hispanics and the Hispanic Heritage Month proclamation in 1990. And he's flanked by the two Hispanic members of the cabinet. The first one ever, Laura Cavazos, and Manuel Lujan, who was by that time serving as Secretary of the Interior. So he had the first two Hispanic cabinet members. The struggle over education and civil rights has helped to define the Mexican American and Hispanic community in Texas and across the United States, because it affects how we celebrate our heritage, how we celebrate and commemorate our culture, and to what degree we do both. It also talks about whom we honor and helps us keep in mind the people who made a difference in the past, in the names not only in court decisions, but the politicians, the cultural icons, whom we honor, help identify us and celebrate our heritage, even if they are in roles that may not be recognizable to others. It also helps us form our memories and solidify the stories we pass along to future generations. And in short, it is the history that we preserve in the Mexican American and Hispanic community. And that's why education is important, and it meshes with culture and identity. And I'll give you a personal example. In 1927, Emeterio Sanchez signed this piece of paper. This is a document of alien ownership of property. He was not a citizen of the United States, but he lived here. His family had left Mexico, probably due to violence or just in search of other opportunities. They traveled by rail from Eagle Pass, Texas, up to near Hondo, Texas. There he bought some lots, some property over time, and farmed. And you'll see at the bottom where his name is signed, there is an X. And it says above it, that's his X, which tells us Mr. Sanchez was illiterate, probably could not read or write, could not certainly sign his name. This is his family. His daughter, Maria, is there with her grandchild, August, in front of her. Her daughter, Isabel, on one side, her husband, Ben, on the other, son-in-law, Tino, and other daughter, Lenora, on their side. A few years later, when August was graduating from high school, a few years later, you see the addition of another young person, and this is me. So this emphasis on education directly affects me. When I was in school, I was interested in history, but didn't often see a lot of people of Mexican American, Hispanic background like myself. And I think people who look at Texas history today often see this because as we have an increasingly diverse population, are we reflecting the other communities in Texas and in American history and the roles that they played? And so when I went to college and started learning about this, I determined that I want people to see their place in history, not only majority populations, but also the various other population groups, ethnicities, and identities that are in Texas and have formed part of Texas history. And so I hope that by talking about who Mexican Americans are, the importance of education in the Mexican American and Hispanic community, and how that ties into civil rights. And although we've jumped around and looked at some different topics, I hope that you can see how this plays into the preservation of not only history, but culture and identity. Thank you very much for your attention, and thank the Bryan Museum in Galveston for hosting me today.